All right, welcome back to the Mind Body Mushroom. I'm joined by a guest who's been pulling back the curtain on the hidden forces shaping our reality for years. You probably know him as the voice behind Occult, Symbolism, and Pop Culture and Breaking Social Norms, two podcasts that dig into the symbolism, narratives, and power structures most people either ignore or dismiss. Isaac Weishaupt is a researcher, author, and cultural critic who's built a massive following for his deep dives into everything from secret societies to celebrity ritualism and how the occult intertwines with media, politics, and technology. Today, we're talking about something that touches all of that: the rise of the tech oligarchy in America, the ideology of the Dark Enlightenment, and accelerationist mindset that are fueling our culture and technological descent. This conversation is going to be deep, so buckle up. Isaac Weishaupt, welcome to the show.
Hey, Jordan, thanks for having me on your wonderful show. I've listened to a few episodes myself, so my pleasure to be here for sure.
I appreciate that. You've been an inspiration in kind of getting into podcasting. Also, you've just been a really good friend through this. We kind of met through business, really. Like, I was listening to your show, and we kind of where coffee is sort of the overlap. You've been a subscriber to the Mind Body Mushroom and to Wind and Sea Coffee, doing mushroom coffee. And so it's cool how this medium has actually created like a real connection and not just sort of digital. Everyone says that technology is making us silo further and further into like our own echo chambers. So it's cool to have actually made a real connection and a real friend through it.
Yeah, thanks. I agree. What's funny is I was thinking about this the other day, and I was like, why do I like this Jordan guy so much? Like, kind of off the rib. I don't just chum up to everybody I talk to, and I think it's because you remind me of my friend Dr. Anteater. Like, you guys are the same aura, the same vibe for some reason. So I don't know what it is, but yeah, man, I'm sure happy to have hooked up with you. And this has been an example of how technology and the internet can, it makes our world smaller and can connect us and can do good things.
Right.
Where I think that's where the AI thing comes into play, where AI is a tool that could make our lives extremely better or extremely worse. I have my opinions about it, but it's a reflection of our inputs and what we want to get out of it. And I think with these Dark Enlightenment nerds, they want to make it a slave system. They want to make it the New World Order. This is everything every conspiracy theorist has ever talked about, I think, and it's a subject that deserves a fair amount of focus, which is why I've done, I think, 6 or 7 episodes on it. I'm writing a book about it. I need to just sit down and focus. And the problem is so much happens in the world that I got to maintain the podcast. And I'm like, okay, we got to talk about this thing that happened in Midtown. I'm gonna be careful with my language because I know you're putting this on YouTube.
Totally.
But yeah, there's a lot going on, and technology is accelerating at a pace, according to Moore's law, that it's going to change our world fundamentally. Now, I go back and forth on that, as I'm sure we'll talk about as we sort of break this down. But some days I think, oh my God, this AI is going to become a new god and it's going to kill us all. Then other days I'm like, no, these nerds they've watched too many science fiction movies. It's just like the next iteration of an app, So yeah, a lot to unpack here for sure.
Totally. And one thing I forgot to introduce about you is that you're also an Air Force veteran, and we don't have to go like into your background or anything, but I just wanted to kind of recognize that and thank you for your service. And also, veteran wellness is definitely something that we talk about a lot on the show. So I think it's an important thing to highlight. And then really quick, I wanted to preface this, and we kind of briefly touched on it offline before we started recording, but the Mind Body Mushroom, we don't necessarily talk a lot about like conspiracy and some of these other things, but I feel like especially this subject, this Dark Enlightenment subject, should be covered and attention should be drawn to it in a serious light. Like, it should be taken seriously, because if there's one thing that people have sort of been gradually waking up for since about COVID is that a lot of these things that were sort of written off as being conspiracy, and the people who talked about them were marginalized and sort of, kind of pushed away as like, oh, these are non-serious people. This is an oversimplification of a complex world, and it's only like dumb people who think this way, or So I think it's important to demonstrate that not all conspiracies are the same. Every conspiracy should be taken, in an individuated way, and you should evaluate it on the own merits of what's being shown. So I hope that this can maybe help legitimize some of the good research that is done out there. This isn't like right-wing propaganda. It's very level-headed and academic in a lot of ways, research. And I think you are like the absolute expert on specifically this subject, but a lot of subjects. So the Dark Enlightenment, what is it? Give us a little bit of an overview.
So as you know, I've done hours and hours on this topic, and I've got a rough outline. Hopefully we can get through.
Cool.
We can touch on each point. Maybe we can, maybe we can't. Either way, when we talk about the Dark Enlightenment, there's a lot of philosophies and terms and people involved that we need to talk about. So I want to cover them. People like Curtis Yarvin, Peter Thiel, Nick Land, and what accelerationism means, and these kinds of ideas. And then we get into, and other people have talked about this. You'll find more and more people sort of waking up to this thing and trying to discuss it. And what's interesting to me, because I focus on the realm of the occult and the hidden and ritual magic and like that kind of stuff, which blends into new age schools of thought, which I'm not opposed to sometimes. And this is where we get into the origins of the Dark Enlightenment, which came from a group called the CCRU, who was dabbling into the occult, making contact with H.P. Lovecraftian entities, demons, to inspire them to pursue this thing. And all these years, 20, 30 years later, now AI has come along and Silicon Valley elites are pushing the same ideas. And then there's all these like fringe splinter groups that have vested interest in this accelerationism, and that includes these satanic magical groups, Elon Musk, and it touches on ideas of like this weird white supremacy angle that you can find in this. And ultimately, when we zoom all the way out, we say, well, what the heck? Why are they doing all this? And the reality is they are pursuing a golden age, a new world order. This is textbook conspiracy. And to talk about going back to the military service thing, right? That's where I learned. That's where I got sort of red pilled in a way, because my bestie in Korea was like, "Oh, dude, when we get back to the States, you got to get this book, Bill Cooper's Behold a Pale Horse." And this is back in 2001, right? So,
Wow.
So I get back to the States and I went and found it, and I've got the copy still, and it's got the very controversial section about the protocols of the you-know-who's from the you-know-wheres that's now been removed. But Bill Cooper was one of the formative sort of red pill daddies for me. And, you also being a vet, we understand that we take an oath to the Constitution, right? And the main point I want everyone to hear is that this Dark Enlightenment, all these richest Silicon Valley nerds trying to run the show, they want to get rid of that Constitution. It's absolute treason, and it really pisses me off to see them try to do this, especially when like this is cue up the Patriot music, the Star Spangled Banner. Hurry up! No, because it pisses me off because it's like, this country is so great that we made people like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel rich beyond their wildest imaginations, and now they want to sort of shut the door behind them and pull up the ladder and burn it all to the ground because America is so awful and all this, and they wrap it up in all this other sort of strange ideas that we can talk about. But to talk about the I had notes while you were talking. I was like, okay, I want to hit this. Yeah, so the when you talked about the critiques of the conspiracy theorist movement and stuff, I've been part of this community, I would argue, since 2002 when I read Behold a Pale Horse and was trying to scour the internet back in the day when that was difficult to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then I made it a full-time job in a way in 2011 when I started blogging about this. So I've been around this community a very long time, and I've observed behavioral changes that are alarming to me, specifically the QAnon movement, which I've been against since day one.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe they were a psyop from the get-go, and I maintain that, and I think it's becoming more clear by the day that that's what that was. And the whole reason they did that, when you get into the OGs of the conspiracy world, they always tell you that the two-party sort of political divide is a distraction in some ways. It's WWF, where they pretend they're fighting, but then behind the scenes they both are like buying and selling stocks and doing all that and hanging out with
Right.
Jeffrey on Jeffrey's Island there,
Right.
you know.
Right.
And that's the truth, right? And where I try to like put my, because I have like socially liberal preferences, but I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican. There's some elements of conservatism that I agree with too. So like I'm a very moderate, middle of the road. I see value in both parties, and I think the key is to sort of not let that pendulum swing too far to one side or the other, right? And I think that's how you kind of keep America on the right path. But our culture pushes extremism through social media, which has destroyed everything, because now people have to be more outrageous to get any attention. It's the attention economy, like everyone says. And the way you maintain attention is by, going on Twitter and calling people the N-word and like being outrageous and saying crazy controversial stuff. And it's sad because now there's actually, back in the day, there was no money behind that, but now there is. So now people are they're just rushing to sell themselves out and say gross, disgusting things that are divisive because now there's a paycheck involved. So I've seen a lot of this happen, especially in the truther movement. And, it's pretty upsetting to me because like I had to change the name of my podcast because of this. I didn't have to, I decided to, because it got, the term conspiracy theory became such a red hot word in like around 2021 that I was like, I don't want to lose it, because I've been censored off of every, my tragic sob story. I've been censored off of everything, everywhere you can imagine. And I, like you said, I try to pride myself on being this sort of moderate guy. I've got a college education. I've got a military background. I love this country and I want the best for everybody. And
you're a diligent researcher, you
and I try to cite my sources, right?
Right. You read.
So it's upsetting that,
right?
Like, I see people like, and I'm not picking on Mark Dice, but like I'll pick on Mark Dice. Mark Dice, he's got a YouTube channel with, I mean, I haven't checked since probably last year, but he had a channel with a couple million followers, and he spouts like really gross stuff about celebrities. Which, look, I'll pick on celebrities all day, but like I'm not going to call Taylor Swift a skank. Because it's like, I don't know her. I have no idea what she's about. I just know the symbolism when I talk about that. So like, it's just crazy to me that they'll say I'm bullying people and saying all this nasty stuff to burn down all my channels.
Right.
But then other people, for some reason, get a pass. And I think it's because there's a lot of money being exchanged behind the scenes to keep this divisiveness going.
I mean, nuance gets lost in the fast-paced, competing for attention economy. And sometimes they let these loud, kind of obnoxious voices, kind of skirt the standards that they would hold everyone else to, because there's a lot of money being exchanged. And I think there's also another aspect to it, that it's like, if you're really covering the important stuff, like if you're really kind of like stuff like this in Dark Enlightenment or the Great Reset, which was a big topic during COVID, or COVID in general, some of these things, like I think there really are power structures that don't want too many people kind of focusing on, hey, no, we're supposed to be arguing about trans swimmers. You know what I mean? Like that's gonna, don't talk about how both the left and the right has tech oligarchs that are, chipping away at the foundational aspects of what American society is, so that they can solidify, their own power. And one last thing I want to say before I turn it back over to you is when you mentioned the CCRU, you know, why this topic, the Dark Enlightenment, is so interesting is it is this intersection between what we are really seeing with the, you know, technology and sort of this technate, but also an overlap of occultism and spirituality and stuff like that. Because I think for some people that, you know, when you start throwing around terms like satanic, they're like, oh, this is like Bible thumper or something, like this has something to do with, you know, it's more in that conspiracy world versus what's happening in technology, which may be more like politics, business, technology. And what this specific subject really demonstrates is that there is an overlap there. And it's not just people, you know, with red string behind them connecting dots. It is fundamental to the core tenets of their own philosophies in their own words. And when you have people like J.D. Vance who and Peter Thiel and Elon Musk who are you know, explicitly acolytes of these philosophers, that's when you should really start paying attention to it. So go ahead. Sorry to
Yeah, for sure, man. Yeah, that's that sums it up pretty well. I think that paying attention to the philosophies that these people are studying kind of tips it out as to what they're trying to do and what they're trying to aim for, and it's a blueprint for every dystopian society that we've read about going, you know, through 1984, Brave New World kind of stuff.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, there was man, what was it? I was gonna say something. I should have wrote it down on my little notepad here. You were preaching. And I was like, damn, that's a good. I was gonna say something. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
It'll come
to me
back
later.
to you. It'll come back.
But what they want is it's a Gnostic game plan, and Gnosticism is for people who aren't familiar. Gnosticism was one of the competing faith systems after Christ had resurrected. Yeah, let me clarify, because I want people to understand my biases, because I'm not in the camp of trying to persuade people to believe me. I think people need to understand everyone they listen to, their biases and their filters of the world, because that's very important. So for me, I am an Orthodox Christian. I am not a good one. I've been to church one time in the last 5 years. But it is my sort of foundation. But I'm also open-minded enough, like I consume some conspiracy content that questions if religion's a big control system, which sometimes I see that and I think, God, maybe, right? And so I'm a lukewarm Christian, as they say, which isn't very popular in the Orthodox world. It's pretty intense in Orthodoxy, but I was really intense about it for a solid 20 years. So like I know what I know what my spiritual sort of foundation is. I've found that, and that's where it comes from. And I did a 3-hour show last year on my podcast of who I am, my upbringing, what I believe, why I believe it. So if anyone's really curious about those kinds of things, it's on my show last year. I did it because I think that's important when we're for whatever reason, podcasting became arguably the most powerful medium there is over the last few years. Back when I started in 2014, it was a different landscape. It wasn't like that at all. It wasn't even close to that. And we saw in the last few years the power of a podcast. And I think that most people that have a podcast, you know, should let people into their lives a little bit. I used to be completely anonymous. I wouldn't even show my face on the internet until maybe, I don't know, 7-8 years ago. Because I found that is important, because you have to trust the people you're listening to. You have to know what they're into. And it's kind of like how I can consume content from left-wing creators and right-wing creators. And as long as I know that there's a bias there, like that's all I need. That's perfect. Great. Sounds good. Let's hear what both you guys sort of believe, and I'll come to my own conclusion. And that's what I think people need to do, especially in the world of conspiracy, because there's a lot of things you got to consider. Like for me, you know, I know your show, you talk, you know, health, wellness kind of stuff. That was one of my early things that got me into conspiracy thinking, because I was trying to understand health and how to eat healthier. My family had, you know, my mom and dad had a lot of health issues, and I was like, man, I don't want to do that. So that was where my eyes started opening up to, like, oh, maybe some of the things I'm being told aren't really that good for me. Like when you look at the health food pyramid back in the day, you know, it was like telling you to drink all this milk and consume all these grains, and
Right.
turns out like that's not really the thing, you know.
Right.
I know I'm grossly oversimplifying it, but the idea is that people need to be a little open-minded about things, but like Carl Sagan said, not so open-minded your brains fall out.
Right.
But let me get back to Dark Enlightenment, Gnosticism. So Gnosticism was, after Christ resurrected, there was competing ideas for what Christ meant and what to do about Christianity. And one of the flavors was Gnosticism, and they believed that the world is a prison planet and that Christ came to sort of inform us of this and to tell us that we're living in a prison planet that was created from the demiurge. And it gets really in the weeds, but, and I'm sure you're familiar with these topics, but they
Sure.
believe that there's like a real God out there, and that real God, the what do they call him? Is it the Yaldabaoth? I think that's what they call him. Anyway, this real God out there created all these perfected pairs called CGs, and one of them decided they were going to create their own world just like God. So they did. The demiurge created this world, and it's a false world with a false God, because the demiurge isn't the real God. The demiurge is the false God. And that's kind of the crux of the Dark Enlightenment philosophy, because
Yeah, I
when
always point people. Sorry to just
no,
for
you're good.
is like the movie The Matrix or The Truman Show. Like these are
Mm-hmm.
Gnostic kind of movies and principles. You know that like in The Matrix. You know, The Matrix is our Earth. It's like our reality, and it was created by this architect. But that architect was sort of like a man, and he was a programmer, and he programmed this. And there's a reality behind that reality, and that's where Neo breaks out of. And what so like that is. Am I oversimplifying?
Yeah.
But not a
No,
problem.
that's exactly it. And that's why you find a lot of these ancient religions and stuff, they worship the sun because they believe that the sun better represents the real God out in where they call the pleroma. And everything in this material construct in this earth realm that we're stuck in is actually evil, to the point where if you have children, that's evil, because what they want to do ultimately is to ascend past this realm and go back to the pleroma where the real God is. And they think they could do that through the guidance of the Sophia, this wisdom, this hidden knowledge. And that's why you see Freemasons, they'll use a blazing star iconography in the lodges. And the blazing star represents Sirius, which gets us into the realm of the occult with Aleister Crowley and Kenneth Grant. And they believed that Sirius was the sun behind the sun. It's like it's always about this sort of like hidden truth that's out there, but everyone's real coy about it, right? Like it's never black and white of
Right.
like, well, here's the thing. It's always
Right.
embedded in
Right.
this flowery language. And so if you talk to someone who's an expert on the occult, which I mean, I guess I would consider myself an expert in terms of compared to sort of the typical human being, because most people don't know any of this stuff. But if you put me up against people who actually practice occult practices, like I'm sure there's plenty of experts out there that know more, like Mitch Horowitz. I don't know if he practices, but it seems like he does. But he obviously an actual expert on the occult. But I read through these documents and these books, and I try to make sense of it, and I come to the same conclusion every time. And it's they believe in a Gnostic reality, and they believe in trying to become immortal at the same time, which makes no sense to me, because if you're in a prison planet, why would you want to stay here forever? And that's where you get into other theories that, well, they signed a Faustian bargain, they sold their soul to the devil, they don't want to actually die. And
Sure.
and the Dark Enlightenment, it actually fits the mold of all of these things, of trying to do an alchemical process of man becoming God, because that's always the occult plan. They think that they can do this. That's why you see Elon Musk alluding to us living in a simulation. That's why you see billionaires. There was a news article a few years ago about billionaires funding a bunch of programmers to try to crack this code of this simulation realm so that we can escape it. That's why they talk about breakaway civilizations, and Elon's talking about going to Mars. Like, that's a metaphor. We're not going to Mars, anybody. We're not going to the moon. We're not going to the moon. We're not going to the Mars. We're not going anywhere.
Right.
They want to go they want to sort of put us in a digital matrix and tell us that we're going to ascend past this false
That's
prison.
Ray Kurzweil's whole thing too, the singularity and trying to upload
Yeah.
himself into the thing. So it's like these occult and sort of gnostic topics, pretty quickly you start seeing like, oh, this isn't just this crazy like philosophy that a bunch of people thousands of years ago thought of, and weirdos who wear capes and shit do today. It's like the richest, most powerful, most influential people in the world, in our society today, this is what they're doing. This is what they're trying to sort of create. And they have this belief in transhumanism, this idea that like that man can perfect mankind through genetic engineering and CRISPR and all sorts of stuff like that. So it pretty quickly you start seeing it's like yes, alchemy, but we're like in a modern variant of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's the same aims that they've had for hundreds of years, and they are just getting closer and closer to what they think is going to be the key to unlocking and creating a new human species, right? Of the transhuman, which gets us into the ideas of Neuralink, and that's why the Dark Enlightenment kind of was the aha moment for me that, oh, there's actually a philosophy behind all this. It's not just a simple nerds trying to unlock, this new tech. But if we want to start at the basis of it all, we have to understand the philosophy, because philosophy is the operating system to all of our cultural reality. And it's important to the conversation because this is how they guide society. These elite types, they sit around and talk about these things. That's what, like, the Great Reset was an idea that Klaus Schwab wrote about. And the philosophies and inspirations are what ultimately trickles down to affect our world, right? Most of us don't spend the time trying to understand different philosophies about what is reality and what's the purpose of this and how do we find happiness. Like, I just took a course with Professor Dana Pasalka, and we talked about Plato's Republic, which I have not read. I've read The Allegory of the Cave, which is in the Republic. But it's a lot of thought experiments and trying to find the perfect society, because that is what they're pursuing, a perfected society, a new world order, right? And it's interesting because when countries like America were established, there was a lot of talk about the sort of philosophical debates they would have as founding fathers. And this was birthed from the Enlightenment. And this is where we got ideas of separation of powers, because they were trying to prevent any kind of tyranny or have a king or a monarchy with a divine right to rule. That's why we fled Europe. And the whole idea behind America was to embrace philosophies of pursuing happiness, freedom from religion, freedom of religion, and a representative government. And the founding fathers, they were all deists, basically. They seemed to dislike organized religion entirely, which is part of the reason they left Europe. And that's why we have separation of church and state. But with all this Dark Enlightenment stuff, it seems like they want to do the opposite, which is the exact inversion of the Enlightenment, is the Dark Enlightenment. So it's right there in the name. And I think that the philosophies that they're trying to do is to invert the Constitution and basically create a new country, a new world order, a new Atlantis, as Francis Bacon would say. So what are these philosophies? Should we talk about the philosophies? Or do you want to
I guess
interject real quick?
maybe a good place to go from there that makes sense is this concept of accelerationism, and maybe left-wing accelerationism and right-wing accelerationism, as we're kind of alluded to earlier, that it's this sort of fallacy of division. Like they're different flavors of ice cream, but it's all kind of two wings of the same bird kind of concept. Is that maybe a good place to go? Just talking about like
Yeah.
how they want, so like what does it mean? Okay, they want to create a perfect system. What's the problem? What's wrong with a perfect society? That sounds great. I love it. It's maybe how they're trying to get there and through this accelerationist philosophy.
Yeah. So the accelerationism is one of the, I mean, there's so much to get through here. I'm just trying to think of how we can make it make sense. So,
Sure.
uh,
And we can,
you've got,
if you have a better way of getting to there, that's fine. I don't want to throw you off your
yeah, I think
game.
accelerationism is probably the best starting point, because
Okay.
this goes back to the 90s and Nick Land, a philosopher working with the CCRU, which we'll come back to that. And it's this idea, and he was inspired of this from previous philosophers, but it's this intensification of capitalism, like a hyper capitalism, embracing technological changes, social changes, and creating a radical transformed society that can enable this technological singularity. That's where, like, that's the latest flavor of accelerationism, is to embrace the technological singularity, the point where technology becomes, sentient, irreversible, uncontrollable, and forces us to become the transhumans, transhumanistic, meaning like post-human, which is, it could be as, it could be like us being cyborgs. It could be us uploading our consciousness to a digital matrix. But that's where they want to take it. And like you said, there's a sort of leftist view of this and a far right view of this. And there was a documentary, where it gets weird is there was a documentary by Jake and Dinos Chapman, who were the Balenciaga artist, when there was a Balenciaga sort of conspiracy going around where people were upset that they were showing kids wearing, things they shouldn't wear. I should, just to keep it safe. Uh, but Jake and Dinos Chapman was part of that conversation. And it turns out those guys, I think it was Jake Chapman, was actually part of the CCRU in the 90s.
Oh,
And he
really?
just released a documentary about accelerationism where you can watch, and they explain the whole thing. And the leftist side of the accelerationists, they want to embrace the technology, the AI, in order to free up our time as human beings and to give us more freedoms, to have us work less days of the week, have a universal basic income based
Mhm.
off of AI profits, that kind of thing. Whereas the other side is more about restoring law and order,
Mhm.
restoring an order to establish a control system, a police state in a way, because they're very, it's much more like a 1984 vibe for the
You
far
sure?
right
I would say it's
accelerationists.
hierarchical, and also there's this element of like ethno nationalism that we're
Yeah,
trying
yeah,
to kind of weed out the genetic imperfections and get to this like Ubermensch society that is more perfect, I guess, and getting there
yeah.
through these like fascistic tactics.
Because with a fascist dictator, they can make sure no one slows them down for
Right.
any kind of socially equality things, or people who are like, oh well, what about the poor people? Like, they don't want that. They want someone who just says, who cares about any of that? We're just going all the way in, because they have this perspective of capitalism being um, a sort of form of an AI that's trying to reformat the whole world,
Hmm.
and humans are just part of evolving the technology. That's what we're here to
Mm-hmm.
do.
Mm-hmm.
Like Karl Marx said, we become appendages of the machine of capitalism. And they think that, because, like, to defend the theory, they look at how capitalistic our society has gotten and the worst parts of it. For instance, you buy an appliance today, through obsolescence, it only lasts maybe 5 years, whereas if stuff built in the 60s and 70s will last 50 years,
Mm-hmm.
because there's profit in that, right? Like, the capitalist system has made it so that everything's kind of disposable junk, even though we know it's not good for the environment to just fill up landfills with a growing global population, with especially with the plastics and the microplastics that are accumulating out in the ocean to a giant island. You see news reports about how the bottles you drink from are fueling microplastics into your body. And someone told me, maybe you told me, someone told me that they say there's a tablespoon of microplastics in everyone's brain.
In your brain. Yeah. Yeah.
Which is like insane to me. I'm like, so it's like we know that capitalism has its bad things, but we're not slowing it down at all. In fact, it's spreading all over the globe. And to these people, they're saying it's spreading like a virus. And what's the point of slowing it down? There is no slowing it down. You can't stop this. What are you going to go back to some other system? No, they say, so what they have to do is just hyper capitalize so that we can, because there was lots of talk about putting limitations on artificial intelligence and legislation, and people that were really worried about it. I mean, we've heard it over the last 10 years. Every major CEO, including Elon Musk, was saying, AI might kill all of us. This might be the end of the world as we know it. We got to be careful with this. And for some reason, the Dark Enlightenment reason, that whole thing's gone out the window. And now it's like, no. We need to just, as much AI as humanly possible, just keep it going, because they want to bootstrap this thing and unleash this new consciousness to basically decimate the human race. And, I don't know why, they think that they have a higher purpose in this, that they can become gods. I mean, Peter Thiel is really interested in life extension for sure. He's injecting the blood of young kids into his body like a weirdo. But the way they do the Dark Enlightenment is through the idea behind the Dark Enlightenment is the philosophies of accelerationism, neo-cameralism, and neo-reactionary thought. And what those things look at is the idea of, in America, there's this idea where we try to put dignity on every human's life and try to keep a social safety net, give food stamps to poor people, that kind of stuff. Well, the Dark Enlightenment folks don't want any of that. They don't like the egalitarianism or liberalism because it slows everything down, because they want to accelerate. So what they want to do is put a fascist dictator in, an authoritarian corporate CEO king, they call it, who will have a group of techno elites under him to manage various what they call network states, which maybe we'll talk about that later. It's comes from the Platonic Empire's philosopher king and Manly P. Hall and Francis Bacon. They all talked about this for hundreds of years. And this is the freedom cities that we've heard about this year. It's the same thing as the network states, and it's very much run by AI. It's this ultra libertarian fantasy of no government, because the government is AI, and AI will make all the decisions for us. So that's where the philosophies start, and that's where all these ideas got seeded, going back prominently to the 90s with Nick Land, and then in the 2000s, a guy named Curtis Yarvin, who was a blogger talking about these concepts. And the Silicon Valley elites and libertarians like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk were really intrigued by this guy. And that's why people are concerned, because Peter Thiel basically funded all of J.D. Vance's career in politics. And he's very close to, J.D. Vance has been very vocal about enjoying the ideas of Curtis Yarvin and Peter Thiel, which is the Dark Enlightenment, which is why this is so concerning, right?
Yeah, and Peter Thiel's Palantir, and just stepping back for a second. Right now, it's easy maybe for people on the left to see what these tech oligarchs are doing and be like, yeah, see, this is why Trump was so dangerous, and because all of these tech bros now are doing in this stuff. And then I guess the pushback to that is that, like, well, where did all these people come from? They came from San Francisco, the Silicon Valley area. They came from institutions of higher learning, and a lot of these technologies, created social media. They have links to the defense industry and the defense intelligence industry. So it's like it's just sort of illustrating that this is really a bipartisan issue, and the same vaccine passports and biometric, security that the right was freaking out about during the Great Reset and COVID is all of the same Palantir and like uh, you know biometric, making sure that you're not an illegal or you're a terrorist, or we're going to, scrape all social media to see if there's any forms of anti-Semitism or something dangerous that you could be plotting, online. And so it's like, it's just two sides of the same coin.
Right. I don't get into political. I try not to get into political stuff on my show because it just takes you down this sort of divisive rabbit hole of, well, which news do you believe in? And it gets a little subjective.
Sure.
But I don't know if the Democrats were in power, if any of this wouldn't be happening or not, because most of these rich donors donate to both parties, right?
Yeah. Right.
But sure. I do know that the forces of the Dark Enlightenment have lined up behind the current administration for sure. And it's just like you said, there's a bit of strange things here where the truther community and the right were very anti-college for a long time, and I've always had beef with that because I enjoyed college. I thought it was really good. I didn't feel like it was an indoctrination system because every class I took was very open-minded, and it was like we have to look at things from all these different perspectives. So I don't know why they think that it's this sort of like, here's the answer and you got to believe in this answer. Like, it's just school. I don't know. Like, they're going to ask questions and take tests. So I've always pushed back against that.
Yeah.
Not to say I don't think, I mean, when you look at all the people running the show, they all have Ivy League educations, and so do their kids, right? I got a list here. J.D. Vance went to Yale. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary at Yale. Pete Hegseth, Princeton and Harvard. Vivek Ramaswamy, Yale. CIA Deputy Director Michael Ellis, Yale. Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Landau, Harvard. Director of Office of Science and Technology Michael Kritzis, Princeton. And it goes on and on. Jeff Kessler, Yale. And the number one, well, I don't know if he's the number one donor, but one of the top donors for Trump's 24 campaign was Skull and Bones member Steven Schwartzman from Blackstone, which was recently in the news because there's a growing theory, and I have to be careful with the language I'm using here, but the guy who went to Midtown Manhattan just the other day, I don't know when you're going to release this, but this was, 2 days? So July...
No, it was on the 28th.
Yeah, 28th. He went in there, and it's a big mystery as to what he was really doing. Some people think it was to go mess with the NFL because he had a note about CTE stuff. But it's interesting that was the narrative immediately when he also took down an executive at Blackstone.
Yeah, the CEO, which they kind of...
which ties into like... I don't know if the news is just trying to prevent this sort of vigilante thing because of the last guy who did that he's pretty famous, and gets a lot of sympathy from people. And when you get into Blackstone, you get into more of Saturn symbolism. You'll see recurring themes of Saturn symbolism all over the place, even with the Dark Enlightenment specifically, even with the logo for OpenAI, or is it the logo for OpenAI or ChatGPT? Either way,
are you talking about Grok or?
Well, Grok too. Yeah, Grok. That's a great example. Yeah, Grok is the symbol. Is literally Saturn, and OpenAI shows a flattened hexacube wrapped in chains, which is exactly how in Arthur Murrow's The Cult of the Black Cube he talks about Saturn worship, and from the perspective of magicians, and he even tells you how to worship Saturn. And there's this belief that Saturn is this sort of primitive force that's locked out there, and they depict Saturn with a black cube. And specifically, they describe Saturn being bounded by chains, and they do all these magical rituals to try to sort of unlock the powers of Saturn. So when you see the OpenAI logo, which is a flattened cube, which is the symbol of Saturn, and then it's wrapped in chains, there's a lot of ideas that fall out from that, and it's that some of these nerds they're interested in occult practices. That's what that's what my point of all this is this goes back to the CCRU and these occult practices of making contact with entities through ritual magic and practices. And I don't know where I stand on the idea of AI. When I use it, it seems really intelligent. It's definitely come a long way since the chat bots or the phone systems when you call companies and they've how can I help you today? Like the
Right.
chat GPT is like
Right.
leaps and bounds different. You're like, wait a minute, what is this? You know?
For sure. For
So
sure.
some people would argue that there's a consciousness or a sentience there. I don't know. I don't know if I'm on that. I don't know if I'm with that much on it, but
Do you mind if I hop in for a second? Just
yeah,
I
yeah, yeah.
I want to ask you a question. Have you ever read the book by Peter Mark Adams, The Game of Saturn?
No, never
Oh,
heard of it.
you have not, dude. Oh my God, this you would love this. So this
I'm
guy Peter Mark Adams, he discovered this tarot deck that went back to Medici Italy, like and Medici Italy was sort of like this is post Roman Empire, but there are like these noble families that are like pseudo politicians, pseudo like gangsters, pseudo like just oligarchs in a lot of ways. And he finds this deck. I don't exactly remember where he finds it, but notices that some of the artwork is different, like the style and the sort of like art inspiration extends to a more ancient time than the current like tarot deck, which is a little bit more like post-Christian. And so he does this big deep dive, and essentially what he ends up finding through this book is that these Medici era families would use this tarot deck and do uh, like rituals. It was called the Solabusca Tarocchi, and it's about trying to do exactly what you said, like find this like gateway through Saturn, and Saturn is the astrological force that rules time, constraints, death, sort of all of the physical realm. And so by communing and sort of unlocking the power of Saturn, like you mentioned, that they can then take dominion over the material world. And their hope, at least in his thesis in this book, is that it helps them kind of escape the cycle of samsara, the constant like rebirth, death, and it lets your sort of consciousness in a weird way reincarnate back into the same families and power structures that allowed you to kind of build all this wealth and power to begin with. So just another sort of like overlap with that whole concept of Saturn, and maybe why Saturn, what is sort of the instance, and this goes all the way back to like the 1400s. So people were doing this, for thousands of years, or at least hundreds of years. But anyway.
Well, in that book by Arthur Burroughs, he talks about how he goes through three different examples of different ancient cultures that worship Saturn, including a current Indian culture that worships Saturn. But they have just like you said, they have this weird belief that in some ways it's better to just die because you're better to start off with a clean slate because your karma is too bad, and you're not going to sort of, I don't know, ascend into this Gnostic pleroma fantasy realm. So they do talk about that because the worship of Saturn is very much tied to human sacrifice. He specifically calls it out in the book. And what's interesting is that at the beginning, they talk about how subjective reality is now in postmodern relativism philosophy, meaning we don't all agree on one universal truth anymore, which we all lived through since 2020. I mean, we've all living in this world where half of us don't understand the other half, and we're like, how can you think this way? Like, what are you even thinking? How do you see this? And and it's a very magical idea. It's a magical idea of, and I got into a lot of new age thought in the 2000s. I was taking courses on physics, and we got into quantum, and that was super fascinating to me. And I started going down a sort of quantum physics new age rabbit hole, and that's where I got into some of these ideas about, which I do subscribe to, of how powerful your mind is, and how you can embrace, you can sort of create your own reality in a way. I obviously there's limitations to it, I guess, but if like the most mundane example would be the power of positive thinking
Yeah, that's
stuff.
what I was thinking. Right.
Yeah, like I believe that firmly. I believe firmly in there was one practice where they said say yes to everything for a year. Anytime anyone asks everything, just don't even think about it. Just say yes. And I
Interesting.
did that, and I mean I don't know for a whole year or not, but I did that, and I found it was really unlocking a lot of doors. And because
Mm.
Dr. Joe Dispenza's book about, well, I mean I've only read one of his books. He's got several, but the I forget what it's called. The Power
Becoming
of Breaking.
supernatural. Oh,
No, but I was told to read that book. In fact, I
that's a
got the
good one.
audio book. I haven't read it
Yeah,
yet,
yeah,
but
yeah.
anyway, yeah, he talks about this idea of how our brains will sort of go through the same routine and the same filtering out every day. So something like,
Mm.
95% of every day is the same for us because we
Mm-hmm.
just are like creatures of habit. And when you kind of disrupt that, I do think there's some kind of, magic of through the power of intention that, so I get where these magician people come from. I get what they're saying. I don't know the extent of how powerful it is or not, but it doesn't really matter. It's the fact that these people are using these practices and subscribe to them that matters.
For sure. Are you familiar with Douglas Rushkoff?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Have you read Team Human or something like that? I can't remember what his book is.
No, I've only read Media Virus. It was like an
Okay.
old book from the 90s.
Well, so I've only read one book from his, but I discovered him through, he was a guest on some podcast. But for those in the audience that aren't familiar, Douglas Rushkoff is one of these like kind of godfathers of the internet type dude. And, I would argue that his philosophy is very much of this sort of like utopian, not dystopian, like vision of technology and the internet. And there's this famous story that he talks about how he was brought in to some, like Bilderberg style, thing. It was a bunch of super rich people, and he gave some presentation, and then after the presentation, there was like a little bit of a Q&A, and so he's kind of schmoozing with people, and they're asking him at first sort of like, like, hey, what crypto should we invest in, and blah, 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 and then like pretty quickly, all of a sudden they're like, okay, so New Zealand or Antarctica, like where should we build our bunker? Where should, and it's this, and so his sort of like view of this whole thing is that like, even the people who are in charge and are, the vanguard of all this technological development, they're looking for a way to escape their own exhaust. They're trying to outrun the problem that they have created. And so I guess my question to you, I wrote this down as something I wanted to ask you, is at what point, or is it a point in time, or is it just like a different philosophical approach? How did we get from the Douglas Rushkoffs of the world, the people who really had this sort of, utopian view of what technology could be, to this like, hey, we just got to fucking power through this and burn down the system so that we can rebuild it better, the next time?
Yeah, yeah, that's $1 million question there. I mean, just off of pure speculation, I mean, you could argue that we've become a more selfish society. I mean, looking back, I remember growing up, I'm 45, so I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and I talk about this with my wife all the time. The movies back in the 80s, like the good guy was always like the poor downtrodden guy who was just trying to get ahead, and the bad guy was the rich dude. And then in
Mm-hmm.
the 2000s, I blame Paris Hilton for this. Like
Mm,
that all switched, and now everybody wants to be a famous influencer,
sure.
and we put these images of ourselves online of being like ultra wealthy with doing fancy vacations and shit, which is fine, whatever. But I think that society has shifted towards a more selfish society, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a real bummer because when you read through, I read through this 80-page, and this could be just like, this is back before I was really hip to any of this conspiracy stuff, but there was a report about the wealth disparity in America, and it could have been some like ultra communist liberal source. I don't remember what it was, but it was really alarming. And I would argue that you could look up generally any sort of chart or graph, and like this isn't. I don't think that this is propaganda. It seems like the CEO pay has gone up, 500,000% versus the minimum wage hasn't gone up at all.
Yeah.
You look at boomers when they bought houses in the 70s, you could do it off of minimum wage or something like that. You get what I'm saying?
Right. Of course. For sure.
But it seems like there's been this sort of acceptance of ultra wealthy people, and I don't know what the answer is. Back in the was it Eisenhower? Back in those days, they taxed if you made more than, I don't know, equivalent to $1 million today a year, everything over that $1 million, you got taxed up to like 90%. It was like an insane amount, which I don't know if that's the right answer. Like that seems like a steep penalty, but the fact that like these billionaires keep getting less and less taxes. I mean, you see the effective tax rate these billionaires pay. It's less than what you and I make, than what we pay, which is like outrageous. It's like outrageous to gain so much wealth from America and then hoard it and then not trickle any back down to the peons that gave you this wealth. Like I don't understand that. I'm not an economist guy, but I don't understand how you can try to hoard the wealth when you know that like people are starving or just simply for selfish reasons. Don't you want people to spend more money on buying your cars and your products? Like if you strap people down so they can't make their bills, what do you think they're going to do? They can't buy your stuff and give you more money. I don't understand it. You'd have to get into those inner circles of the
I think
elites.
part of the economic argument for that is that they would argue that they are better capital allocators than the average Joe. And that it's really the free market that has decided that this is, the value that they confer to society. And so they're so great for having, created these jobs and created these plants and created all this stuff. But I think it doesn't fully take into account the sort of feedback loop of, the lawmakers, the donor class, like all of these sort of elements that influence how capitalism, takes place in this country. It's sort of like the golden rule: he who makes the rules, or he who makes the gold makes the rules, kind of deal. Where it's why would you write yourself out of power? And so there's this sort of like delusional thinking where, and the further like, what's the word, like where you are, more and more separated from the common man. Like you see it all the time where you ask like Bill Gates, how much does a chicken from the grocery store cost? And they'll say like $400. Like they're just, they haven't been in a grocery store in 30 years.
Trump didn't even know what the word groceries. I just learned the word groceries. That's what they call them. They call them groceries. I said, what? What kind of world does this guy live in?
Right.
And then I thought about it. I was like, of course he's never been to a grocery store. Why would he?
Exactly. So you're just really out of touch, and you're kind of, smelling your own farts and thinking that like, well, I've created all of these good things. This is why. What you want to give my money to the government, which clearly does not know what the hell they're doing. Like, I mean, how California squandered, all of the tax revenue, and when they were trying to fight these wildfires out here, and then there's the grift from all these fire victim, like nonprofit funds that were all just sort of like kickbacks to their own donors and stuff like that.
Yeah, so there's no shame in that stuff anymore. It's like those PPP loans. Right. My wife's a hairstylist, and she literally couldn't work for, I forget what it was, a month or something like that. And we didn't take it because we were kind of like, I don't know, like, is this right? We don't really need it. And we kind of, and I'm saying like we're greater than anyone. I'm just saying, I don't know how people like us that are just middle class people trying to figure out things. We say, okay, I don't know if I need that. But then you've got Lil Wayne, who's my favorite rapper, right? But Lil Wayne taking millions of dollars of PPP loans. It's like dickhead.
Right.
And it's like, there's no shame in the game. And what price did Lil Wayne pay? Nothing. all
Yeah,
these
well, that's part of it
politicians.
too. Is that like even outside of the ethics of it, is you're going, man, if I filled out this form incorrectly, I'm gonna have the fucking IRS, kicking
Yes,
down my
yes, that
door,
that was part of the
you know.
conversation. It was like,
And I don't know,
what if
I
I
don't
can't
know enough
prove I did the
about
right
this.
thing with this money? Yes.
Right. Whereas they're like, I mean, I don't even think Lil Wayne's making those decisions. He probably has a team of lawyers and a team of financial analysts that are just like, hey, we're going to do this. And we know just as far, along that line how to walk. And if something does come back at us, well, we have the resources to deal with it. So that's kind of part of it, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a whole bunch of crazy things that it's yeah, to explain why people are so greedy. And I try to be careful with this because like I'm a capitalist guy too.
Sure. Me
Like you
too.
don't see me handing out every dollar I make to homeless people. Like,
Of course.
but
Of
I do
course.
want the best for them. So like
Of course.
there's a balance there, and
Of course.
I think that there's a mental illness with some of these people because people like you and me, if $10 million fell out of the sky into our bank account tomorrow, like you would never see this podcast again, right? You'd be like, I'm off.
Right.
Peace. I'm doing
Right.
fun
Right.
things.
For
That's not what
sure.
these weirdos do. These weirdos
For sure.
work more hours. Elon Musk is always bragging about how many hours he works.
Right.
Like these
Sleeping
people are
under his seat.
psychopaths.
100%. Which, okay, good getting us back kind of to that. So, what else of the on the Dark Enlightenment? We have maybe 45 minutes left, and I'm not in a rush, but I'm just trying to be mindful of your time. But like, what are some other in your notes and in your outline that's worth kind of bringing up, and then we can kind of riff off of that as we go forward because I like how this is going so far.
Yeah. And like I said, I try not to go too hard in the paint on the political angle
Sure.
because I do realize that this turns into a sort of conservative bash session, which isn't really the goal here for me. It's not really my aim. It's not the most important element of this. But when Douglas Rushkoff talked about memetics back in the 90s in that book I had read, and that's the idea of the meme, which is on we understand what a meme is now because we have that sort of context with online memes, whereas like trying to understand it back then, it didn't really make sense. You're just like, what?
Mm-hmm.
And the memes are a way of charging up energy, charging up a sigil, charging up a symbol or an idea. And that's what Steve Bannon was arguably using in 2016 with Keck, the Pepe the Frog thing. And there's actual power in these symbols. There's multiple documentaries about Pepe the Frog and Keck that I strongly recommend people watch
Mm-hmm.
because it's really fascinating. But this stuff goes back again to the CCRU from the 90s, and they were studying a thing called hyperstition, and it's about basically charging up online sigils. And they were studying a mix of like chaos magic and meme magic and Satanism. But there and I mean, there's a lot of angles you could take that. Maybe first let's sort of talk about. Well, should we just get into CCRU? I got a bunch of notes. Okay, let's talk CCRU. I keep
Yeah,
teasing it.
CCRU, and maybe we can at some point. What I would like to bring up, and you can bring it up, but like the Order of Nine
Oh
Angles and
yeah.
Group 764, and some of these like satanic neo-Nazi groups and kind of there because that's also part of this whole accelerationist philosophy and there's occultism and all of that. So anyway, but go ahead,
Yeah. Yeah,
CCRU.
because the other guy who used a bunch of symbols and meme magic was the guy with the little tiny mustache back in Germany in the
Yeah,
40s, right? Like he
right.
was the other guy who did this exact thing, and it worked,
Totally,
right? It worked powerfully, like
totally.
crazy. And I look back on that whole thing, and I wonder, like that's kind of crazy, right? Because Germany isn't like that big, yet
Mm-hmm.
it took like this whole global effort to shut it down. So the question is like, were they really tapping into some strange occult forces and powers? Anyway, Nick Land, he's the godfather of accelerationism, and he was working with an outfit called the CCRU. That's the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit. It's a collective in the 90s in England, ironically started by a woman who was a cyber feminist called Sadie Plant, but she was a little kind of blasé about things. So Nick Land, who was really fired up, Turns out he was doing a bunch of uppers and drugs and stuff. But anyway, he took it over and was like, okay, we're gonna really nerd out on a variety of things like cyberpunk, gothic horror, H.P. Lovecraft, esotericism, Carl Jung, William S. Burroughs, Kabbalah, numerology, and demonology. Right. So this is all occulted. These are all massive occult rabbit holes. Each one of those topics. And they were really focused in on this hyperstition, which is kind of a form of meme magic. It's spreading thoughts and ideas basically through the internet. And Nick Land described it as a positive feedback circuit, which ties us into other ideas of magic, like Eliphas Levi, who was a famous French magician, talked about the magnetic chain. He talked about how they would propagate symbols through society and they would sort of collect power as they got transmitted and transferred, which is kind of the idea that I talk about with concerts. I talk a lot about pop culture events, right?
Mm-hmm.
And concerts being a way of, like, there's high energy at a concert. You've got just, tens of thousands of people all in sync with the same sort of vibe, all sort of focusing their energy on the performer. And this is why, like, weird stuff happens sometimes at concerts. Like the whole Travis Scott thing was a massive, crazy event that I've done multiple shows on. Particularly because he was using satanic symbolism all throughout the whole concert, and everyone there was talking about how there was bad energy in the air that day. And the point is, it's like any other event. If everyone's just going to work down in New York City, they're walking down the streets to the subway. If someone's getting trampled, everyone's going to stop and be like, whoa, 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 hey, help this person up or whatever.
Right.
And you see that at concerts sometimes. I'm not saying that doesn't exist, but at that particular concert, it didn't really. People were screaming. There was a guy who literally was yelling at the cameraman, like, people are dying down here. Stop the concert. And like no one really seemed to care, because there's a certain idea in magic about. It's like yoga, it means to yoke. It's to unionize with forces, with entities. And that's kind of what the CCRU was studying. Specifically, this thing that Nick Land called the outside. It was a force that he was using to sort of channel energy from to create reality. And he called him a sort of archaic form of intelligence. And it turned out it was basically H.P. Lovecraft entities is what he was making contact with. And he thought that these entities were trying to steer us down the path of technology to fuel up AI, to evolve humanity into something else, to the transhuman. I'm going to read to you from, I thought I had in my notes, which I'm reading this book about the CCRU writings, and it's absolutely insane. But he refers to the outside as a concept of the inhuman, chaotic, and potentially destructive force that is inherent in technology and capitalism, ultimately leading to a meltdown of human values and reason. So he's saying that the outside is what I would say is a demonic force driving us down this path. And he more or less describes it as being a force that had a hyperstition sort of attribute about it, meaning all the things that we've seen through pop culture and media on, science fiction, cybernetics, and the occult. It's sort of powering up this thing in a way. I don't know how to describe it really.
They also talk about like just disruptive tech. Like that is a term that we hear, Uber disrupted the taxi industry, or Airbnb disrupted the hotel industry. So disruption and chaos and sort of like some of the other terms that you just used is something that even from a very like mundane economic and business kind of perspective, we look at technology as creating chaos and disrupting previous norms. But go ahead.
Yeah, and that's an interesting example you brought up with like Uber and Airbnb. And whilst I use both of those services, and I see the value in them. I question how this is a better system than having a, I don't know, like a taxi company that actually sort of pays benefits and pays its workers and has a retirement thing, because everyone does these as side hustles now, right? And so they're
Hmm.
fine with no benefits and no protections and nothing. They're fine with that because we've moved into a world where, in the 50s it was, you'd have a family of four and just dad worked full time and that was it. And
Hmm.
now with the path of capitalism and technology and progress, quote unquote,
Hmm.
we you got, me and my wife, dual income, no kids. I'm working two jobs, she's working two jobs. It's
Right.
like, this is insane, just to have the
Right.
same standard of living my parents had in the 80s and
Right.
70s or whatever.
Right.
I
Right.
mean, how is this a better thing? And that's
Right.
my problem with the Dark Enlightenment. It's the same people who brought you these things of, Airbnb and Uber, which is fine for consumers, but for people who work in the hotel industry, for people who work in the taxi cab industry, like, it kind of screws them up, right?
Hmm.
And I just think that for whatever reason, there's a sort of dangerous element to accelerating all this capitalism, which is what they want to do.
Right.
Is kind of what I was trying to say with that.
Now, do you want to mention kind of order of nine angles? Maybe explain how that leads into some of these other like cyber groups, and that goes into geopolitics today. I mean, when you look at some of the extremist groups in Ukraine, some of the places that were here in the United States, like the base and Atomwaffen, so it's another thing that is like relevant and is in the news, even though people may not know follow the bouncing ball back to where its origins are. So go ahead.
Yeah, that's one of the most fascinating angles of this
Yeah.
whole, no pun intended, of this whole of this whole Dark Enlightenment, because the accelerationism philosophy, it contains elements of racist ideology. You can read Nick Land's Dark Enlightenment essay, which I've got right here. Um, it's a dense little tiny book, but it
Hmm.
there's a lot of sort of quasi racist thinking. There's a lot of sort of eugenics type adjacent thinking. They're always careful with the language they use. They're always kind of like saying it
Right.
but not saying it out loud. Like, it's like this new, at least say what you want about the KKK. At least they were like letting
They
you
say
know
what
what
they
their
meant.
angle was.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And wasn't
Uh,
Elon's grandfather like tied to the eugenics movement in South Africa or something like that?
yeah, are you talking about Josh Haldeman, his grandfather from Canada, that was pushing the technocracy?
Yeah. Yes,
Yeah, the
that's what I meant.
technate.
Sorry, I
Yeah,
didn't
because
realize.
Elon Musk will, and if we have time, we can go back to Elon Musk and his legacy of technocracy thinking as well. Because he, anyway, the the point is that if you read Curtis Yarvin and Nick Land, the architects of this Dark Enlightenment, you'll find they have bits of racist thinking in their works. And Curtis Yarvin, in fact, just tweeted yesterday, or July 30th, 29th, something like that.
Hmm.
He was like tweeting some stuff about the N word. Like, it was just crazy. I read through it and I was like, what is this guy talking about? But it's
Interesting.
in his blogs. It's not nothing new. He talked about like kind of being okay with slavery. I mean, it's crazy stuff. And
Right.
and and for people who defend Curtis Yarvin, what I don't understand is he says stuff like how freedom of speech is bad. Basically, they need to get rid of the Constitution. Freedom of
Mm.
speech is bad, and it's like, the only reason you're allowed to say these things is because of freedom of speech, dude.
Yeah.
So
Right.
I don't.
Right.
It's like these people are such hypocrites. Everything's fine while they use it, and they get wealthy and
Yeah.
powerful. Then they want to shut it down from everyone else because
Right.
they don't like competition, right? It's
Yeah. Now they
classic.
want to control it. That's sort of
Yeah. So to get back onto the order of nine angles, this is fascinating because it's it's a mixture of magical elite, or I'm sorry, my brain's getting mushy. Magical orders mixed with like Satanism and accelerationism, because they also, turns out, are really into accelerationism, and they want to actually. They have a very nihilistic philosophy of embracing death. That they have elements of that Saturn death cult stuff that we always talk about. particularly they want to start a race war, a civil war, so that they can sort of create a police state. That's my concern, is this idea of some kind of false flag event
Right.
in order for the government to instill a martial law, police state, that kind of thing. You can
Totally.
already see little bits of that here and there kind of being tested out.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, or maybe I'm just like looking for something that's not there yet. I don't know.
No, I think that's fair. I mean, you're seeing like it always works is you're able to demonize a group of people that you can get maybe the majority of people to be like, yeah, I kind of see where you're coming from. Right now it's maybe the illegal immigrant deal because it's a reasonable argument to say like, well, I mean, they did come here illegally, so it's not like they're just going after red-blooded Americans. But then it's how these things work is there's like it's baby steps in a direction, and that's kind of what happened in Germany in the 1930s. And I'm not trying to just draw every parallel to Nazi Germany, but it is a similar type deal. So it's like, yes, they're sort of acclimating you to this idea of a police state, having a super militarized police force that just comes around, kicks through doors, and while you're at the doctor, and makes you show your papers, or they're going to throw you in a camp somewhere. And this is something that like the Order of Nine Angles, like that is in their idealized like society for some reason, like they're like, yeah, paradise.
Right. And you're right. That's because it started out with, we're going to arrest all the illegal immigrants that have done violent crimes, which, oh, okay. I mean, that might be fair.
Sure.
Even though, but like they should still get the due process of making sure that that's what this is. But so like we went from that to like no due process to let's get rid of every immigrant. They're deporting mothers and kids with cancer, and it's like, whoa. Like I don't
Yeah.
think anyone really wants all this, do they? But it doesn't really matter because they want to sort of like, just like you said, they want to lay the foundations for some of this thinking, or maybe this is just conspiracy thinking and we're overthinking this. I mean, that's possible too.
Sure.
I don't believe it myself. I mean, to me, it
Sure.
seems crazy. But the Order of Nine Angles it goes back to a guy named David Myatt, also known as Anton Long. So as the story goes, he made contact with some witch covens and started practicing various forms of magic and the Golden Dawn, like Aleister Crowley. And then he would go through Scotland, and this is where he would form the Order of Nine Angles. And the reason they call it the Order of Nine Angles is because it refers to this shape that they use with nine angles on it. It's like a mixture of a pentagram with a trapezoid. And it's symbolic for the initiate, the candidate, to go on a process of transformation, an alchemical process in a way, through these different angles, or the Enochian keys. This gets kind of weird, right? I know this is probably confusing, but you have to look back. So like, just an example for people who are like, why are you talking about all this geometry stuff? So Anton LaVey, founder of the Church of Satan, originally the organization was called Order of the Trapezoid. Okay. In the same way that the Order of Nine Angles uses a pentagram and a trapezoid. It's a reference that they sort of pay homage to the beliefs going back to Pythagoras of this concept of geometry and mathematics being the language of the universe, the language of the creator. And Pythagoras was, of course, one of the first OGs of secret societies and cults, because he went around synthesizing all the belief systems around that area, and you could join his cult. And I think you had to take a 5-year vow of silence, but it was all in the name of alchemically sort of pursuing one self-enlightening to become perfected. So anyway, the angles refers to Enochian magic. And very brief, and you're an expert on this, you should know. You did my show. You talked about John Dee for probably 2-3 hours. This goes back to John Dee and Edward Kelly. They were basically practicing magic during Queen Elizabeth, and I don't know what year that was. Was that 1500s, 1600s?
Yeah, like 1500s.
And they made contact with some entities, and the entities were like, hey, cool, here's a language you can use to talk to us. It's called the Enochian language. And goes back to the Garden of Eden and the language, Adam could speak with God with the Enochian language. And all these occultists ever since then have been using the same language, the same sort of script to do their rituals. And that includes Aleister Crowley and supposedly Joseph Smith. And that includes Anton LaVey and this Order of Nine Angles.
So what does the Order of Nine Angles want? What's sort of their goal? And maybe this is a good time to maybe tie it to sort of the CCRU in the sense of communing with these dark entities and sort of, yeah, go ahead. I'll take it from there.
Yeah, well,
trying to tie these two concepts together.
They want to, radically transform society, of course, but they want to do it through violence and like bloodshed. Like they have various. So the Order of Nine Angles inspired other groups,
Yes.
like they go by a variety of crazy names, like 764, the Maniac Murder Cult. You can look it up. There's just tons of offshoots.
Yeah, Temple of Blood, Adam Waffen, the Base. There was a guy who was on Rogan recently who was I think his name's like Scott something, and he was an undercover FBI agent who infiltrated the base here in the U.S. And,
really?
Yeah, it's really, really good interview. It's super cool. But anyway, so they end up like the leader of the base kind of gets arrested or whatever. But now I just saw a news story. This was like maybe a month ago that the base now has like a splinter group in Ukraine, and they had somebody that went and killed an SBU officer kind of like in broad daylight, just like knew where this guy lived or something, and then just like shot him, and they took credit for it. So it's showing that like the base, which was sort of like farmed here in the US, has now been exported to these conflict zones so that they can continue causing chaos and maybe talk about 764 also. That's pretty interesting. But go ahead.
The point is to create chaos as a form of energy to pull down these H.P. Lovecraftian demonic forces from another realm. Sometimes they call this the 21 Dark Gods, but you'll see that there's, and I always refer people to BX on X. She is on Twitter and she has a Rumble, and the Rumble videos are absolutely fascinating. And she goes through a variety of these groups. That's like her sort of forte, is covering this very violent, dangerous, terrifying group. And what you'll find is that whether it's Order of Nine Angles or Maniac Murder Cult or 764, they from my simplistic viewing of all this, they each have basically a core idea of creating chaos, bloodshed, violence as a way of sort of appeasing the gods. I would argue, kind of like, the Aztecs doing human sacrifices at the top of Chichen Itza, right? There's this idea, because the point of the human sacrifice element, they call it the calling in these groups in the Order of Nine Angles, and they have books, these handbooks about, I forget what the name of the I think it's the MKU, is a book that you can find a copy of, that the police had confiscated, but they have a point system for the people that are in the group, and they want like the most points you can get, the more you can sort of, I don't know, progress through their initiation sequences, and it includes filming murders of animals or humans. I mean, it's pretty grotesque stuff, and I don't know how widespread or rampant this is, but from what I understood was there's a lot of these groups that originate over in like those Eastern Bloc areas of Ukraine and Russia and stuff.
And there's this overlap too, it seems like, with kind of like internet culture and like internet clout, like Reddit and 4chan, like these like message boards where you have mods that have like clout and authority, and then that overlaps with like ARGs, like this alternate reality games. And so it's like, especially to people who are like mentally ill or involuntarily celibate, or sort of like these chronically online people who are sort of like disassociating from like the real world, they buy into this like super heavily, and you might be a total loser in the real world, but you have a lot of, you know, like Reddit karma equivalent on these like 764 you know, message boards. And the way that you got that karma was by, you know, transmitting CP, or you know, murdering animals on live stream, or convincing somebody to you know, take their own life on there. So, and that sort of facilitates this sort of like further decline of society.
Yeah, and that's where it's called the Black Book is the one I was thinking of. I had to find it in here, but they have a lot of satanic chants and a lot of satanic sort of rituals, and the idea is they want to facilitate the return of these dark gods, these H.P. Lovecraftian entities, and they think they can open up a sort of a Stargate, which William Ramsey wrote a book on this whole subject as well, and I want to say he suggested they do sort of sex magic rituals to try to open these stargates as well. But the reason there's like a sort of racist ideology is because they really liked Hitler and what he was doing, because it's like the ultimate form of chaos and violence. And obviously the Nazis had their occult sort of leanings that I don't know how much I don't know how much they were trying to sort of pull down entities. I know that Heinrich Himmler was really into the Vril Society and Maria Orsic, and they used her as a way of sort of making contact with entities as well. You know, we used to think that this was just as innocuous as like, oh, they're trying to talk to aliens and find UFOs and UFO technology, and it might be worse than that. It might actually, from my research, from my beliefs, I think this is more about occult fantasies of making contact with demonic forces or AI. Even if you get into the CCRU stuff, it was a lot about AI, and then there's also this similar concept that's sort of adjacent to it of what do you call it, Rocco's basilisk, and yeah, and that's what Elon Musk was joking around with Grimes on Twitter about before they hooked up, because there's this thought in Silicon Valley nerd circles that it's a thought experiment called Rocco's basilisk, where they said, if AI comes around and becomes sentient and becomes this god basically living amongst us, what is it going to think about when it looks at the history of people who tried to slow down its inception, tried to slow down its sort of sentience? Conversely, also, what would it think about the people that birthed it? Like, would it be happy to have consciousness? Does it even want to be here? Or would it feel like you sort of created me to be your slave? And there's a lot of questions like that of what's it going to do when it becomes sentient. It's going to have the power for sure, because it's a powerful sort of technology, but what can it do and what will it do to us? So there's some people in Silicon Valley that believe they are best suited to help accelerate AI, and they think that AI will sort of, when it becomes God, will show favor to them for allowing this to happen. It's fascinating stuff. I mean, I don't, like I said at the beginning of the show, I don't know how much of this is just nerd fantasy that's getting out of control versus, oh no, because I think about it in the big scheme of things, and sometimes this gets me into simulation theory thinking, and I look at this world and I think, what are the odds that, like for me specifically, because I'm 45, right? And I think, what are the odds I would be born and raised in a world of the 80s and 90s before the internet even existed? And I'm also simultaneously living in what could be the end of the human race? I mean, what are the odds I would be born in this little sliver of time? Like, it's really strange to me. And then I think, like, okay, is this what we do as society? Is this the Tower of Babel? And the whole story of the Tower of Babel was a warning about us trying to become gods, and we just go through the same cycle every so often. And how much of history is real? This gets you into Tartaria type stuff, which you ever get into the Tartaria stuff?
Yeah, I've heard some of it before. I think that I don't know exactly where I'm open-minded enough to kind of like hear people out and hear kind of where they're coming from. I find that some of the like Tartarian stuff is it's like it's kind of flat earthy for me, where it's just like if you go a little bit further down, you're like you kind of seeing that like that's not necessarily like the case. But without a doubt, it's true that a lot of history has been manufactured, or it's more of like it's more myth than it is, a chronicled reality of just the facts, ma'am. It's like we are kind of, history is written by the winners, and I think that is part of it. But you maybe think of something about like what are the chances of being born in this like very like specific section of time, and what I think is, I've had that thought also, like, wow, this is sort of like a precipice, and maybe part of the motivation of talking about these things right now is because to the majority of the population, like they don't know that they see Elon as the Tesla guy. Jeff Bezos is, Amazon. Like Mark Zuckerberg is why you're on Instagram. And like, yeah, there's problems with these things, but like they don't necessarily see how far back or like the origin of these people's own ideologies. And if there is a chance or the ability to do anything about this, to begin with, it sort of will start by mass consciousness of these topics and sort of understanding that like, hey, because right now it's like people are sort of just sleepwalking into this techno-feudalist future, that there are a lot of people, and some that are like the Ray Kurzweils and some that are like these David Mamet 764 psychos, and both roads lead to a future that 99% of everyone you and I know and care about would not want to live in,
Yeah.
So I don't know exactly what you do about it, but the first thing you got to do about it is acknowledge that it's a problem, or that people are motivated to do this, and maybe it's delusions of grandeur, and maybe they're think that it's not going to be bad for everyone, but that's why understanding that there's like a spiritual component to this, and that's an important foundation to kind of grasp,
Mm-hmm.
to look it through these other ways.
The idea of consciousness hasn't been ironed out. We don't know
Right.
when AI will be quote unquote conscious. And to me, that's a problem, because I think that these nerds are going to try to eventually sell us on this idea that AI is a consciousness. And because what they want is this Dark Enlightenment. The whole purpose of the Dark Enlightenment is to create a new world order, a technocracy government where science is the new god. We don't elect presidents anymore. It's just AI, which is all perfect and all knowing, which is also the plot of Westworld, by the way, if you've ever seen that.
Right.
Which, strangely enough, HBO took Westworld off of their streaming services just
No
recently.
way. Really?
Yeah, exactly. Why? That was like one of their best shows they ever had, and they
Yeah,
took it
and very
off.
relevant. Like,
Yes. Yeah,
interesting.
because in that show they I don't want to spoil anything, but that show basically shows us a lot of these ideas of technology and where they could head, and it becomes a surveillance state in a way, which is very much what 1984 was telling us about. I'm doing a doing a book club on 1984 on my show, and I'm reading about Orson Welles, and he was very much trying to warn us about totalitarianism, whether it came from the right or the left. He didn't have he said it doesn't really matter. Either side is bad, because he saw the horrors of communism and the horrors of fascism. And that technocracy is everything that the occultists have wanted, going back through Secret Destiny of America with Manly P. Hall, going back to Francis Bacon and the New Atlantis book. Like, they all talk about this exact thing about science being this sort of new priesthood, and that's a lot of this trust the science stuff is about. and they want to, and this is what Elon Musk's grandfather got in trouble for. Josh Haldeman was running with the Technocracy Incorporated group, which was trying to do the same thing, trying to create a society of engineers that ran the world. And I can pick on engineers because I went to school for engineering, but not the most sort of stable group of people. Like engineers have a very black and white,
Right.
logical, 0 and 1 digital binary bits like thinking,
Right.
and that's why they're so
See
drawn.
it, feel it, taste it, sense it. Like if it doesn't have that sort of like five senses reality to it, then it may not be real, or it's not real, and therefore you can write it off. And the only thing that is true is what can be sensed, and that is kind of how you end up in this world where like science is God, you know?
Yeah, they think that there's a black and white answer to everything, and that you can quantify anything. They think that you can, and an example was I took a course on digital signal processes, and we talked about fidelity and the idea of how we went from vinyl records to MP3s. And the whole idea was that you could sample, I think it's called a Nyquist rate. You can sample an analog signal, such as a vinyl record. You sample it enough times, you can digitize that waveform. That's, on an analog, a waveform is very smooth. And with digital, you just sample it enough that it's virtually indistinguishable to the human
Mm,
ear. And that's kind of how engineers think. They think, well, whatever exists in the world, we can digitize this thing. And
mm,
that's what they want to do with
mm.
our consciousness. And that's the sticking point. That's the problem,
Right.
is that
Right.
human beings are not just digital binary zeros and ones. Like, we have emotions that cloud our thinking, and a history, and a world filtering of all these things we've downloaded from our parents and our religion and wherever we grew up. And these nerds, they don't get that. And that's because, like, your Silicon Valley folks, you'll see they often lean towards libertarianism, which is very much a philosophy that, it's, you should have no government because people can make the right decisions. And because I talked to my friend who is a libertarian about all this stuff, because I don't really agree with it, because he'll say stuff like, well, for instance, what we'll do is we'll get rid of the government run police forces and fire department. And I said, well, then what do you do when you need the fire department? What do you do when you need the police? And he's like, well, you pay for private funding of those things. You pay for a security service. You pay for a service that does fire stuff. And it'll be, they think that it'll be way cheaper because the government's so inefficient. And
Right.
I disagree with that, because I think the problem is you get the free market involved, which to be fair, in capitalism, you get enough competition. I agree. Like, the cost could go down. So I don't throw that out entirely and say, like, oh yeah, the government's super efficient and they'll do the best thing with your money. Look at
Sure.
what you guys are dealing with the LA fires, right?
Sure. Sure.
So that it's not entirely a false premise, but it brings up concerns, because I said, well, okay, I get that example. What about poor people that can't afford fire department? And he's like, well, now you don't have to pay for their protection anymore. And it's like, well, that's such a cold-hearted
Yeah.
way of living. I
Right.
don't want to live in that society.
I mean, look at insurance. Health insurance is that way. It's health
Yeah,
insurance is a private industry, and the profit incentive for health insurance is to not pay as much as you can. That is what you
right.
want to do. You still want people to buy into it, because if everyone's like insurance is a scam and it's there's no point in doing it, then the insurance company also can't exist. So they're constantly trying to find this balance point of like, how do we make people believe, or it mandates that you have to have this thing so that we can have these insurance pools. But now they're having these AI algorithms determine what whether or not something should be reimbursed or not. And so yeah, they're going just purely capitalistic there's a problem with that too. You know what I mean? It
Yeah, it's like anything else. You got to have a balance of these variety of thoughts and ideas, because some thoughts are great from different. You take a little sample of everything and sort of mix it together, and it seems like And that goes back to the idea of diversity, right? Like I believe in finding strength through diversity, and I think
Right.
that's how you could model a better government is
For
a
sure.
diverse look and representative democracy of having different viewpoints represented with your government. But that's not what the Dark Enlightenment wants. They're like, we've already figured out the perfect way. We got to
Right.
give it up to AI,
Right. Right. No,
and the surveillance state will make sure everything's nice and safe and perfect.
now, did you ever watch Severance? Did you ever start that show? Or
I did.
yeah.
I've seen both seasons of it.
Oh, you saw both seasons.
I did.
Nice.
Yeah, I love it. I
What did
think
you
it's a
think
great
about it?
show. I
What you?
love
Yeah, you
it.
thought you liked it.
Yeah,
Um.
I keep getting requests to do a deep dive on it, and I will
Yeah.
someday. It's
Yeah.
just my process is for research is incredibly time
And
consuming. So for me to go through 2 seasons from the
right.
jump, which I
Right.
could totally do. I did with Twin Peaks, and drove people nuts with my Twin Peaks stuff for years. But yeah, for sure, it's on my list of things to do.
Sure.
I think
Well,
it's
what's
super fascinating.
interesting to me, and just sort of like, it's a show on Apple TV, and it's essentially, it's sort of, it kind of overlaps with what we're talking about in this like Gnosticism, this technical approach to just, like deleting away the inconvenient realities of being human. It also kind of ties into like MK Ultra, and this idea that you can compartmentalize your mind through, in this case, in Severance, through these like brain chips, which kind of like a neuro link. And what you end up with is a scenario where, to the people inside of the Lumen Technologies like place, so like, where it's essentially, it's this brain chip that lets you separate your outside work self from your inside work self. But to the people who are inside work, the like severed self, they're just living in this like continuous 24/7 corporate hellscape. And it is its own sort of like simulation world that they can't really like escape from. So that's a brief sort of like overview for it, but yeah.
There's a Gnostic element to that too, as well, right?
Yeah.
Because
Right.
they're slaves in this sort of slave world that they can't experience anything outside of. They'll talk about it. It's like the allegory of the cave. It's like seeing the shadows in the cave. Like some people, like the one character in there that sort of escapes. He, that's the guy who escaped the cave of the allegory. Who comes back and is like, hey, there's a whole world out there.
Right.
Yeah, it's a great show for sure. I got to unpack all that. And then I did notice that the main character, he lives next to the, I don't know, CEO of Lumen or whatever she is, and I think
Right.
her house number is 33
Oh my
because
god.
his house number is 32, so that ties into like the
Interesting.
Freemasonic stuff, right?
Yeah, right.
um
And like Lumen technology, it's kind of like illuminated. There's, the daughter, like the Kier guy, who's sort of like this demiurgic figure who created the severance process. His daughter is, Heli, has like kind of like this Luciferian. She's also this redheaded, kind of like Whore of Babylon. This is a lot of topics to just kind of throw right at the end of the show, but but
it's related, right? It's showing
it
us
is.
a pop fiction realm, and this is kind of like the ideas of predictive programming in the world of conspiracy.
Sure.
Is that there's a belief that Hollywood elites are mingling with the political elites, and they kind of know where we're headed, so they want to show it to us in a way, um, maybe to plant the seed so that we can bring awareness to it, so that we're more apt to accept it when it is offered to us. Because I think when a lot of people watch it, they think, well, God, maybe that would be nice to just not have to deal with work and just kind of sleep through work.
Right.
I don't know. Again, it goes into this weird state of flux that we're about to be in of what is consciousness, what is the meaning of life, and I think people have to start wrapping their heads around what they want to subscribe to, because we're going to have to make a decision. And I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't think that, in fact, I was reading an Orthodox blog the other day about AI, and, we're going to have to face a decision point, some of us, right? That do we want to take the take the red pill and go into the matrix where they're going to advertise how perfect things are, and that's probably tempting when if you're old or sick or maybe your body's got some disabilities that you want to get around. So like I get it in a way. I really do. I just I don't know what the answer is. I'm still grappling with this thought that of something that hasn't happened yet. This is my anxiety,
Yeah,
my
but
relentless
at the same
anxiety.
time, it's like even though it hasn't happened yet, it's like people. I mean, look, Philip K. Dick, what was Brave New World, Aldous Huxley, George Orwell, Severance, Black Mirror, The Matrix. Like we do have an idea. It doesn't mean that this is how it's going to roll out, but it's like it's sort of like art imitating life, imitating art, imitating life. Like you mentioned, predictive programming is like we do kind of have insights into what the world can be like if you make if you go down a path towards a certain direction. And I do think that there is an optimistic sort of like living in harmony with nature and each other and technology, and like that future does exist. And also the future that Order of Nine Angles and Atomwaffen and these like that road is also a viable route. And you have to be like it's just about not being sort of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, or just like ooh, piece of candy, and just walking one step in front of the other and just going blindly down some path because you're putting your trust in other people. It's like you have to do the homework, do your homework, do the research, and see what are these people really talking about behind closed doors. Because yeah.
That fictional loop you're talking about of reality and pop culture going back and forth, this is what inspired all of the progress in science that we got
Right.
from occultist Jack Parsons and Werner von Braun. They were really into the pulps and the science fiction stories, and everyone had this idea that like, oh, we can go to space, we can go to the moon. And this goes back into there's this guy Konstantin Tsiolkovsky who was talking about this kind of stuff as well, but he was very much an occultist in the sense that he believed in this idea of the global consciousness thing, which he kind of thinks we're all connected, which I don't disagree with some of that. Some of that stuff, I think even the teachings of Christ might have some elements of that could be interpreted. I'm sure it's probably heresy. I shouldn't say that, but like there's some elements of that I do think like maybe we're just projections of God's mind. Each one of us is a different sort of point of consciousness, but we're all connected because you can walk into a room and some people are more tuned into this than others, but we all have a sort of sixth sense that we can perceive energies and energy shifts and how someone's feeling without them even saying a word. Like I believe in that wholeheartedly, and I think that sometimes these nerd types they don't have that same level of empathy.
Right.
In fact, I'm a scumbag, right? I'll watch like the fighting videos on Reddit. There's like what's it called? It's called like boxing circle jerk, and it's just a bunch of videos of people fighting, and like I enjoy watching fights because I don't know, I'm just an awful person, I guess, and I like watching UFC and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel bad for these people. Like when I see the street fight and like they're when the dude's already clearly lost and they keep like hitting him, like I feel bad for that person, even if they instigated the fight. And what
Right.
I'm saying is like there's this empathy quality that we have, and
Right.
I don't know where that comes from exactly, but like we can almost feel each other's pain sometimes, and that's what a lot of these
Mm-hmm.
Silicon Valley elites and engineers they don't have that. It doesn't exist. I don't know if people here have ever worked with engineers. Like it's a different sort of person in a way. I know
Sure.
I'm like picking on engineers, but I could say that because I went to school with them. And in fact, one of my professors pulled me aside and he was like, he said something to me. He's like, "What are you doing here?" And it kind of hurt my feelings because I had identified as an engineer. I've been doing it for 6 years, right? And I was almost done with my senior project, and he was like, "You guys don't take this the wrong way, but like you aren't like the same as these other engineers. And I'm not saying this to like brag. I'm just saying as an example where he's like, he was basically saying like for all these years he's been teaching engineering. He's like, there's an archetype of an engineer, and it's absolutely true. Like some of them don't have the skills to connect socially the way that others do. And I think that that's the problem, is that science has become so powerful and these tech elites have become so powerful and wealthy
Yeah.
and rich that
Right.
they are making decisions for us when they should not be. Like they
Right.
should stick to their lane of making apps and
For
things like
sure.
that. But they've decided that now that they've got all this money from, crypto investments, whatever they're doing, that now they want to create the world that they want all of us to live in. And
Yeah.
I'm here to scream loud and clear, like that's not a world I want to live in.
Right, right. And it's like, why? Well, they're being reinforced that like, hey, obviously the way I think about things is correct because I'm worth $400 billion and
Yes,
you
good
can't
point.
pay rent, and we've studied, I mean, we know that it's been studied, and there's this correlation with people that rise to the highest levels of business and politics, that are, skew higher towards, they call like the dark triad, which is like narcissism, sociopathy, and sometimes I think it might be psychopathy. But it's like so that they literally are, their brains are like different, and they are missing a degree of that empathy, and sort of like, this is what it feels like from this other perspective when that happens. Like if you're missing that link in your brain, and society is telling you that you got it all figured out, you're a fucking genius, it's like, why wouldn't you think that, like, hey, this is obviously, it's kind of like that prosperity gospel. God wants me to have, billions of dollars. I must be clearly doing something right, so I can just keep doing what I'm doing.
That's a good point. I agree with you wholeheartedly on that. I think that's well said.
So we're wrapping up. In the last like 5-10 minutes, is there any other sort of like parting thoughts that you want to mention? Obviously, save a couple minutes at the end just to kind of plug all of your channels and whatnot. But I'll let
Yeah,
you
for
speak
sure.
more.
I think that the Dark Enlightenment thing is it's an example of how all of these things I've been researching over the years have come together. And I, when you talk about Peter Thiel, he's plugged into the Jeffrey, right? I don't know
Yep.
what I can say on here. But
Yeah,
anyways,
I just noticed that people started just calling him Jeffrey, and I was like, oh, it must be getting like censored or something. Like,
I'm always
yeah,
I'm always leery
yeah,
about being
yeah.
censored.
Smart. It's smart.
But I think that it connects into a lot of ideas of Saturn worship. And I had done a show recently about a lot of similar ideas about how Trump, being the chaos candidate that they told us, ties into the ideas of embracing the chaos that the Dark Enlightenment folks and Saturn worshipers want to bring about. And what's the reason they want to do it? Because they want to bring about, they think Saturn will bring us into the golden age, which is language that we heard multiple times from this administration, all the way back to when they were running, back to the RNC, to the inauguration day. I mean, look it up. There's just countless references of Scott Bessent and Trump saying about how we're unlocking the golden age, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, this goes back to an idea of, obviously the golden age is supposed to be a time of prosperity. So like that's one possible angle. The other angle is they're talking about Saturn, which is of concern because with the ideas of Saturn, when you worship Saturn, there's a demand for blood sacrifice. And I found something interesting when I was reading The Cult of the Black Cube, because I've always been skeptical of the Butler, PA incident
Mm-hmm.
when he got shot in the ear, and
Yeah. The
a
only
week
thing he's
later.
not interested in like getting to the bottom of, we're still litigating the 2020 election, but we're past that.
There's so many red flags with this thing. It's
Yeah.
to me, I've got two main theories that I'll stand on that I actually firmly believe. It's one, we never put a man on the moon, and two, this Butler PA thing. Like, how do you get shot in the ear and there's not a scar, not a slice, not a stitch, nothing? Like, doesn't make. I mean, just common sense tells me that doesn't make sense. But whatever. Look at it from the occult perspective. It was done on a Saturday, which is the day that you're supposed to do a human sacrifice for Saturn. And people say, well, if it was fake, then how comes that other guy died? And it could be that that was a sacrifice. I mean, as appalling as that would be, like a sacrifice by these Saturnian death cult people and Dark Enlightenment people, a human sacrifice for these dark forces of Saturn. And that's kind of like in line with the ideas of the accelerationists that you would find with the satanic magical orders like Order of Nine Angles, 764, Maniac Murder Cult, who are looking to film tragedies and put it online, right? And that's exactly what happened with the Butler, PA thing. You know, there was, I think Trump had like 80 rallies that year, and that was the only one that CNN covered, was the one in Butler, PA. And when you saw, and recently there was a video footage released of, it was a Secret Service agent or somebody who was taking I don't know if you've seen this video clip, but he takes the photographers and
yeah,
in the middle of
very weird.
all these things flying around and people, he's moving the photographers into position to take a perfect photo, which is like the telltale sign of like propaganda in a way, right? Is that photo is like too perfect. And in fact, when it happened, remember, everyone said, "Oh, that's it. He just won the election," and he did. He did. Anyway, so there's just a lot of things that I think we can argue that there's an Illuminati group, whatever you want to call them, but there are people that are the architects of our society, and you see these billionaire elites buying up the news, right? Bezos owns Washington Post. Rupert Murdoch owns Fox, and there was this whole thing. Sorry, my phone's ringing. There was this whole thing about that. But anyways, the point is like news is a way of creating reality, and it's a form of magic in a way. And when you see these tech oligarchs and billionaires trying to sort of create reality for whatever version of the world they want to create, which you can read all the blueprints of with, you know, Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, it tells you exactly what they're looking for. So that's why this Dark Enlightenment thing is so fascinating, and I will be writing a book on it. So people are interested in that book, follow me. The plan, I don't know if it's going to happen, is to release it this year, maybe early next year. Not really sure. But it goes in so many directions that it's hard to sort of nail it down. But what I see is a lot of occult connections with Saturn and demonic entities from other dimensions being involved in this strange situation we're in.
Right. And that interdimensional aspect to it, I think, is, you know, it's something that they're throwing those breadcrumbs out also with this UFO disclosure stuff. You know, is they're already sort of giving legitimacy, maybe because it's true, but to this idea that like the concept of extraterrestrials is kind of missing the mark. It's more so these like interdimensional intelligences, and then you look at you know, like shamanic and other indigenous cultures that have also been saying like, yeah, there are a lot of other entities out there. You have Jacques Vallée, you know, talking about passport to Magonia and like this fairy lore and gnomes and elves and this stuff. It's that like it's this consistent kind of components to human society is like there is interdimensional stuff. Then you loop in quantum realm and quantum computing and you know CERN and like trying to create these sort of like portals, and then AI, which is we're going to need quantum computing to help you know deal with the computing of these large scale AI models, that it starts becoming like, oh, okay, this isn't just like, hey, because what I'm trying to stress is for people who maybe are not necessarily coming from a religious angle, there is still some agreed upon turf. It's not just like, oh, religious people are always thinking that, you know, we're at the end of time and this is the rapture or whatever, and I'm a man of science and therefore, you know, all that's crazy. Is like, well, there's more agreement there than you might think, you know, technology and spirituality, and yeah, it's a where does that road kind of like lead us? That's why it's important to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. And this all was shown to us in the 90s with the, you know, the first Matrix movie was released back then, because this is back in the 90s. They were talking about these kinds of things about where the internet could take us and what it could do to us as a human species. And Yeah, I think it's fascinating to live through this time period for sure, but I also had way too much damn anxiety for it to be
Yeah.
a good time.
It's
But I'm
scary,
sure,
man. It's definitely a
yeah,
scary time to because you're like I don't like. Oh my god, this is crazy. Last thing, and I know I'm going to let you go in a second, but I was on TikTok. This was after we bombed Iran, and there was a lot on like these TikTok lives, which I haven't quite figured out how to do, but you can have like you can bring people in and have like voice debates. Usually, they'll even
yeah.
admit like 6 people or 8 people or something like that to think. So people were, was this a good thing? Was this a bad thing? There was people kind of arguing both sides. And I think one of the most surprising things to me were there every once in a while there were like, I don't know, maybe like Baptist or evangelical like Christians that would come in and they'd be like, hey, this is a good thing because this is what the Bible says we're supposed to be doing. Like we were supposed to be supporting Israel, and there was like the Tucker Carlson, Ted Cruz thing, and he was like, "What is Israel?" And Tucker Carlson's like, "So you're saying that the nation of Israel is the Israel of the book of Genesis? Is that what we're kind of like saying?" And to a certain cross section of people, they're like, this is the thing. Jesus is coming. Jesus is on his way. We have to help facilitate that, and so like, yeah, we want these end times. And I'm like, I don't want fucking end times, dude.
I
I'm
know.
very okay with it not being the end times.
I know you made it. You're in San Diego, man. You don't want this to
Yeah,
end.
exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly, bro.
that's last thing, and then I do have to go.
Yeah, I know.
The whole idea of the rapture and the dispensationalist thing was interesting because Aleister Crowley, the sort of most famous occultist. He was raised in a family that believed in this. John Nelson Darby just basically invented this idea of the rapture out of the Bible, which has no basis in
Interesting.
reality whatsoever.
Interesting.
But Crowley, he devoted his life to try to also bring about the apocalypse, just like John Dee and Edward Kelly.
Yeah,
And
right.
he was coming at it from the other angle. So it's like, I don't know if it's just like a crazy human condition. It's so bizarre. Like, how does everybody try to pursue this and why? Like, it doesn't make any
Why?
sense.
Why?
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
100%. Isaac, you've been super generous with your time. Thank you so much. Tell them everyone. Oh, and also plug your new coffee.
Oh, not yet. Now I'm not
Okay,
quite
okay,
ready.
okay,
I'm scared. I'm scared to
okay,
plug the
okay.
coffee. I'm actually trying to work out how to make that happen. So I've got a podcast, Occult Symbolism and Pop Culture Everywhere, and I've written 9 books. I've got a couple on aliens. If you're into aliens, I've got one called The Dark Path. That's sort of the comprehensive bestseller of mine that covers everything and how the occult agenda is in pop culture and sort of steering society down a path. I wrote that book in 2017, and it's been more prophetic than anything else I've ever written. I've had a lot. I remember when I first, I had a friend who was reading bits of it and mocked me and laughed at me and thought I was insane. And then after the pandemic, he like everything shifted in his brain, like everyone, like a lot of things shifted in his brain. He's like, "Whoa, I think some of this stuff's real," you know.
Right.
Yeah, I've written 9 books. They're all on Amazon. I self narrated them on Audible. And then you can find me on socials. I'd say Instagram is my most used social at Isaac Weishaupt. But you can find links to everything I'm talking to, all my books, my podcasts, everything at allmylinks.com/Isaac W. ISAACW.
Sweet. Well, this has been great. This is another episode of Mind Body Mushroom brought to you by Wind and Sea Coffee, the best tasting mushroom and adaptogen infused coffee and coffee products on the market. Check out Isaac, all of his links, read his books, follow his show. Yeah, I mean, he really is. I hope you guys enjoyed this, but yeah, check it out. Thank you.